Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a UK political and American political analysis. I'm going to go to town on this topic because it is much, much more important than many people possibly understand it to be. I think the scandal of the BBC that I'm going to talk about is indicative of a much larger campaign and project that is going on, which is essentially the Americanization of British politics, the invasion or the importing of MAGA republicanism or MAGA anti-woke conservatism into UK politics. And I think there's a concerted effort to pull the rug out from under independent journalism, but particularly public service broadcasting in a way that we've seen in the US with PBS and NPR being defunded over there. And this is a classic move of autocrats and autocrat wannabes. And you find that the people in the UK who are absolutely calling for the destruction of the BBC essentially are those who would seek to exist in a British autocracy. So before we look at what Donald Trump recently said, and I'm assuming you kind of know what's happened already with the BBC. So we had a splicing together of two parts of Donald Trump's speech on the January the 6th that was used, I think, to generate a feeling that he was inciting people to go down and fight at the Capitol. But actually, there were two separate parts of the speech that were put together. That didn't need to happen because actually Donald Trump was trying to do that. So I don't think there's any issue with like Trump's position on January the 6th being misrepresented. It wasn't. It's just that speech was, I think, used somewhat disingenuously, and that's something that had minimal impact, right? Because this documentary, and this is very important, Panorama, was not shown in the US, right? And so it didn't have any meaningful effect on the election and on defaming Donald Trump and so on and so forth. And no one really noticed about this until a memo was, scare quotes, leaked by someone who was associated with the BBC, who was appointed by other people in the BBC who have a very right-wing bias. So both Matthew Prescott himself and other people like Robbie Gibb. These are people who are foxes in a hen house, if you like. And the memo was, it included a number of different criticisms of the BBC, but it wasn't this kind of impartial release, because actually, although the guy was, I think, in charge of impartiality, he was far from it himself. And like I've talked to you previously, the BBC is a political football between the left and the right, and whoever's in government will try and put people on the board of the BBC who reflect their own political ideals. And then the BBC is always fighting to maintain its funding, which means it generally will skew to trying to appease the right more than the left. They know they're always going to get the funding from the left, but the right is always going to try and cut their funding. So if they're going to appease anyone, they'll naturally try and appease the right. So politically speaking, there's this general sense that, Nigel Farage is a person that's appeared most on BBC Question Time, right, in history, and mainly as an unelected non-politician. And Reform get platformed hugely, and the question is why when they only have 5 MPs do they get on TV more than, say, the Lib Dems, who have 72 MPs, or the Green Party that also have 5 MPs. We hardly ever hear from Green Party politicians, elected MPs, but we're always hearing from Richard Tice and Nigel Farage, and then Zia Yusuf. So I think that there is this desire to kind of platform the right at the moment, and that is reflective of not necessarily who's in charge, but who's actually in positions of power within the BBC board of directors and so on and so forth. Anyway, it is becoming a political football, not within the domestic politics of the UK, which it is, by the way, as well, but between the United States and the UK as well. So this is what Trump said just on the recent interview with Laura Ingraham, which was a bit of a disastrous interview, but that's another question. That's another topic of conversation. This is what he threatened.
Are you going ahead and suing the BBC?
Well, I guess I have to. Why not? Because they defrauded the public, and they've admitted it, and their top echelon.
Director General and the CEO
This
both
is
resigned.
within one of our great allies. This is supposedly our great ally, BBC. The government has a chunk of that one, I guess, but that's a pretty sad event. They actually changed my January 6th speech, which was a beautiful speech, which was a very calming speech, and they made it sound radical, and they actually changed it. What they did was rather incredible. They're showing me the results later on, the results of what they did, how they butchered it up. But it was very dishonest, and the head man...
I love the fact he says it's absolutely incredible what they did. They're showing me what they did later on. So you don't know what they did. But you're okay. So he takes a lot of this on what he's been told, and he hasn't seen it, and yet he's taken to court for $1 billion. Okay, so he's taken the BBC to court, which is a taxpayer funded or license fee payer funded organization. So effectively, he's taking the British public, in a sense, to court. Okay. Christopher Seal says Donald Trump's threat to sue the BBC in London is preposterous. He remains in breach of the English High Court orders in a case he brought and lost against Orbis 18 months ago. So any further abuse of the UK courts by him for such legal tourism and intimidation should be prohibited. So we understand actually that he's more likely to go to court in Florida, right? But then, I mean, there's this statute of limitations on libel in the UK, it ran out in October. So he can't really go to court in the UK. So he's going to choose Florida, but the show wasn't shown in the US. So there's a lot of question marks over the legal basis for his court case. But I think what's really interesting, this is where we start joining the dots and fitting this into a larger attack, right? So you had, at the same time as Donald Trump attacking the BBC, you had Israel coming out. So John Simpson, the famous reporter for the BBC, said, and now Israel. Here's part of a statement from its London embassy. Quote, for years, we have repeatedly warned about the BBC's consistent failures to uphold the standards of accuracy, impartiality, and integrity expected from a public broadcaster. So this leaked memo had a number of things. It wasn't just the Trump panorama documentary, which is so minor, it should have just taken a short apology and maybe reprimanding or firing or suspending the editors of the Panorama program and the producer of the Panorama program. But instead, what happened is a director general and the CEO of news, I think particularly in London, Turness, Tim Davie and is it Deborah Turness, they resigned. That's like, I don't know, CEO of a stationery company resigning because one of the cleaners didn't do a very good job of cleaning the toilet. You're like, really? Okay. So yeah, they do need to uphold accuracy as much as possible. And what they did was wrong, but it's been blown out of all proportion by all sorts of people who want to see the BBC fail. And then, so the supposedly leaked memo also included an issue that they were too favorable to Hamas and not favorable enough to Israel, whereas actually many others have criticized the BBC of being too favorable to Israel and not nearly critical enough of Israel. So they get attacked on both sides of this. Well, when you understand who Robbie Gibb was, the guy that got Prescott into the position to then eventually release the memo, and you understand that Robbie Gibb was he's bought out the Jewish Chronicle newspaper, you're thinking, okay, so interesting. So was this an inside job? And then you have Israel kind of joining in the criticisms, and then you have the Russian embassy now echoing Farage, and because Nigel Farage has obviously come out and had his tuppence with regard to the BBC. The Russian embassy is now echoing Farage and Trump's talking points about the BBC. This isn't coincidence, it's coordination. So there's a very good case to say that this is, even if it's not premeditated, coordination, it's subsequently a coordinated attack on the BBC. So they're undermining the one broadcaster still bound by impartiality, and Britain becomes a propaganda playground. Murdoch was first through the door when the Berlin Wall fell, not to spread democracy, but to control the narrative. From Moscow to London, he's built empires on the ruins of truth. So the Russian embassy here saying BBC journalists manipulate facts and censor information that does not align with their partisan editorial stance. Ideological dogma has replaced journalistic ethics there, distorting the very principles of media independence and freedom of information. Of course, you might imagine the British embassy saying that in Moscow, they'd be kicked out of Moscow, right? So the Russian embassy is going to town in support of this attack. Kirill Dmitriev has come out and said a whole host of things, just a couple of them, as the envoy for the Russian envoy, saying USAID, which is a form of funding that the US was giving to support all sorts of things around the world, including journalistic freedoms. USAID was one of the top funders of the UK government-owned BBC for many years. I mean, this is a complete bastardization of the truth. What happened is USAID funded a BBC charity that supported training up, I think, journalists around the world and trying to get journalists interested in freedom and so on and so forth. So this is a complete distortion of the facts, including at the very moment the BBC doctored President Trump's speech. So yeah, Kirill Dmitriev piling in, also saying here answering somebody tweeting the UK is not America's ally, the UK is a deep state's ally. They have been along every step of the way in the ongoing criminal conspiracy, blah, 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 blah. So you've got someone slagging off the UK, and Kirill Dmitriev comes in and says, awakening? ? Quote, you can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. Abraham Lincoln. And so Kirill Dmitriev is just stoking this. This is working to the favor of Russia, Israel, and obviously MAGA republicanism and, the Trump government in the United States. Trump seemed to be almost gleeful when he was talking to Laura Ingraham just then. He was laughing, sniggering at times, like in a way that he wouldn't if he was being called on to be critical of Russia or China. He can't do that. When was the last time he's properly critical of Russia? And yet here he is, absolutely loving the fact that he can go to town on the BBC. That should tell you everything you need to know about Donald Trump and where his allegiances lie, which is, attacking freedoms and critical press and doing everything he can to maintain power and move his country to autocracy, and then have that happen in the UK as well. Kirill Dmitriev, again, goodbye to the most unpopular prime minister in history, Keir Starmer. So apparently there's now chaos in Downing Street, as apparently people in the Labour Party are thinking, well, can we do it? Should we do anything to replace Keir Starmer as prime minister? This kind of political chaos that is working alongside this or being facilitated by the BBC's scandal is exactly what right-wing populists would want, like reform. AFD, I'm sure they'd be happy with the Keir Starmer out. Rassemblement National, MAGA Republicans, they want, even though Donald Trump said he likes Keir Starmer, realistically, the right wings around the world would want Labour out. And this is exactly what the Kremlin wants. They are freaking loving this. And this is an attack on UK, I think, democracy, on our norms, on independent and accurate and objective journalism, although they did make a mistake. But you want to talk to me about the mistakes Fox News have made, or the lies, the outright lies? They had to settle $788 million out of court with Dominion for lying about the election in 2020. Just absolutely staggering. You tell me that GB News are accurate. Really? Okay. So everyone makes mistakes. BBC made a mistake. The line should be drawn under the stand. Apologies, bish bash bosh, get on with it. But now this is being blown up. I think the BBC responded poorly to the original accusations, and this has not helped the situation they're in now. And we can see, people like Joe Rogan. He's going off on the BBC for manipulating Trump's January the 6th speech. You're supposed to be the news. You're not supposed to be the propaganda arm of whatever party you support. This is nuts. This is effing nuts, says Joe Rogan. Well, thanks for your opinion, mate. Okay, so, everyone is piling in. Now, John Sopel, the former BBC American editor, or their editor in America, said this on his Newsagents podcast with Emily Maitlis and Lewis Goodall. He points out that Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's a right-wing conservative, kind of, you could add Boris Johnson into this, are in the same boat as the Russian embassy over the BBC.
This reputational piece of it, which I think is so fascinating. I kind of noticed on X this morning a tweet from none other than the Russian embassy, where they are saying, let me just read it to you. BBC journalists manipulate facts and censor information that does not align with their partisan editorial stance. Ideological dogma has replaced journalistic ethics here. Well, frankly, irony is dead when you get the Russian embassy lecturing you on journalistic ethics, having shut down more or less every free newspaper. But how weird that we now find the Russian embassy in the same place as Donald Trump, as Nigel Farage, as Jacob Rees-Mogg, as some senior Tories who are calling for the BBC to, be almost defenestrated as a result of this. What an unusual bunch of bedfellows they are. And I think it speaks to the BBC. Fearless journalism is what terrifies politicians, and they must not be cowed. Well,
really, really good point there. But honestly, when you understand who is attacking the BBC now and understand that Nigel Farage is in bed with Trump, well, that's understandable. But then you look at Benjamin Netanyahu, okay. But then you look at Kirill Dmitriev and the Russian embassy and Putin and Russia, and you're thinking, honestly, this is not cool. And then just almost unbelievably, so the Daily Telegraph, which is a right-wing not Murdoch newspaper, is a right-wing newspaper that has become more and more populist as the years have gone on. They are the paper that broke this news story with the supposedly leaked memo. They are now, this is a headline from the Telegraph, as Matthew Stadlin says, the Telegraph appearing to side with a foreign president over British licence fee payers. The headline is, "This is how Trump can sue the BBC and win." It's almost like they are cheering on. The right-wing media landscape in the UK is essentially becoming MAGAnized. That is what is going on here. So honestly, this is way, way bigger than you think. We are starting to see an Americanization of UK politics, and it is very, very scary. The tagline is, US president has shown he knows how to take on media organizations and make them pay. Okay, so you want the British license fee payer to be paying Trump an extra $1 billion, do you, Daily Telegraph? Okay. Traitors, anyone? You talk about poppies and traitors and this and that, and you talk about your national traditionalism and so on and so forth. You virtue signal all day long about that, but when a push comes to the shove, Daily Telegraph, you're treacherous, in my opinion. Pretty incredible. So we go to another just here, which is Mehdi Hassan, who says, nationalist politician says she is on the side of a foreign government over British interests. Fascinating. Who's he talking about? My local MP, Suella Braverman. So Suella Braverman was a former Home Secretary, I do believe, for the Conservative government. So she's a big Tory bigwig here. Again, just rather like the Daily Telegraph, with the BBC facing the threat of legal action by President Trump for doctoring footage of his speech. Starmer has a choice to make. Does he support President Trump, or does he continue to defend the BBC's misleading reporting? The choice is clear. I know whose side I'm on. So the Conservative Party appear to be on the side of the Americans suing the American president, autocrat wannabe, trying to sue the crap out of a cornerstone of the British society. Will Hutton here says, Farage, Johnson, Badenoch, who's the leader of the Conservative Party at the moment, et al., congratulating themselves because Boris Johnson was involved in this as well, not only in appointing some of these people when he was Prime Minister into the BBC board that we're going to look at in a minute, but also in his newspaper articles in the Daily Mail or the quotes that he's given as well. And so Johnson is right in the middle of this. So Farage, Johnson, Badenoch, et al., congratulating themselves on humbling the BBC now have to decide whether to back Trump's potential $1 billion lawsuit. No More Traitors, Strictly, Match of the Day, Graham Norton, Jules Holland. So these are all sort of BBC cornerstone programs, flagship programs, all have to pave the way for 24/7 GB News. There you go. Our so-called patriotic politicians seem more than willing to side with a hostile foreign entity over the BBC, our national treasure, and one of the handful of British institutions still respected around the world. The BBC is the most respected news organization in the world, if I'm correct in saying, according to polls, pretty much all the polls. The BBC is up there. That's what these people want to destroy. Not one of these people has ever anything positive to say about our country. One of them, Nigel Farage, even went so far as to travel to America just to badmouth the UK in public. None of them stands up against Donald Trump, JD Vance, or Elon Musk, and they insult our institutions or country. These politicians don't work for us, and they definitely don't love this country. I completely agree. Now, Ed Davey today in the House of Commons said the following. He's the leader of the Liberal Democrats. They have 72 MPs in the House of in Parliament, whereas the Reform lot only have 5.
Great British institution is under attack from a foreign government. President Trump is trying to destroy our BBC, not because he cares about the truth, but because he doesn't want to get away with his lies. Trump has undermined press freedom in America. Now he's trying to do the same here, disgracefully egged on by the leader of Reform. So will the Prime Minister tell President Trump to drop his demand for a $1 billion settlement from the BBC? And will he guarantee that President Trump will not get a single penny from British licence fee payers?
Let me be clear, I believe in a strong and independent BBC. Some would rather the BBC didn't exist. Some of them are sitting up there. I'm not one of them. In an age of disinformation, the argument for impartial British news service is stronger than ever. And where mistakes are made, they do need to get their house in order, and the BBC must uphold the highest standards, be accountable and correct errors quickly. But I will always stand up for a strong, independent BBC.
Great Britain.
And that's all fair enough. What I'd really like to see is a massively robust defending of the BBC against Trump. And I think someone's asked about the Trump bit and he didn't want to speak about Trump. And I understand that from a diplomatic point of view. And this is how serious, of course, the issue is that you know, this could get in the way of the relationship between us and the United States. But that's largely Trump going to town on trying to sue the BBC. So, you know, that now we're going to listen to Alan Rusbridger. I've just started The Hack on ITV. It's an absolutely, I've only watched one episode, but it was so brilliantly put together. And it follows the hacking inquiry of the News of the World that caused it as a tabloid newspaper to go under. It was one of Murdoch's flagship tabloids. It got into trouble for hacking, and it was the Guardian journalist Nick Davis that kind of did a lot of the work for that. And his editor was Alan Rusbridger, who's played by Toby Jones in the excellent Toby Jones in the drama. So really well worth watching, at least so far. It's called The Hack. Anyway, Alan Rusbridger, interestingly, is somebody who is a serious person from a serious journalistic past, who has been touted as a potential for the BBC head job. But the problem is it comes with so many pressures, I think, the Director General. And this guy, formerly of The Guardian, being put in charge, I think he'd be a great choice. But I also think the people on the right would just go absolutely nuts. But there, you can't win. You try and appease the right and you put a right winger in charge, which is kind of what's happened previously. And that's what Boris Johnson did. And they still get sacked. So Tim Davies gone. Actually, he was seen as an appeaser to the right. You put someone on the left, the right's going to be baying. Put someone on the right and it still won't be good enough. This is Alan Rusbridger.
BBC is now headless. It's been decapitated at a time when it is coming into a very crucial period of renegotiating the charter. It's got to agree a funding formula for the future. We're sort of 3.5 years off from a general election where a populist right could get in, and the lesson from around the world is populist right-wing governments tend to try and capture the media, and they certainly don't have much time for public service broadcasting. BBC is now.
That's really, really important. So what's going on here is a populist right are in the ascendancy. Reform are likely to majorly challenge from the next election, possibly get in. That could spell the end of the BBC, or they're going to be massively controlled by Reform. Because look at what happened in Hungary. Look at what is happening in the United States, the defunding of NPR and PBS, and then Trump taking CBS and ABC to court, New York Times to court, Wall Street Journal to court, and now the BBC to court. This is what the right do. For me, 5 alarm bells are ringing, right? I am so perturbed about the state of politics at the moment. Alan Rusbridger, again, the BBC can retrieve something from this mess and show the US broadcasters what a spine is by sending Donald Trump a 4-letter response. See you in court. Yeah, we will see. Now, this is where we start joining a lot of the dots. And the Byline Times has done some amazing. I'm really proud to support the Byline Times, to be a subscriber. This is an excellent article saying BBC bias memo. So this memo was authored by a lobbyist tied to pro-Trump tech giants. The leaked memo that fueled Trump's attack on the BBC was written by a lobbyist at a firm paid by US tech giants tied to the president. We're going to start with this, and we're going to circle back to it a little bit later. So the author of the leaked BBC bias memo, seized on by President Donald Trump to threaten $1 billion lawsuit against a broadcaster, is a right-wing lobbyist whose firm is being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by US tech and media giants with close ties to Trump, to whom they have donated millions. One of them, Oracle, is owned by Republican Party megadonor, who in November 2020 spoke with Trump aides about delegitimizing the US elections, and who is actively seeking to reshape the US media landscape to benefit the president. The lobbyist, Michael Prescott, was reportedly appointed to the BBC advisory position under the influence of the BBC board member, Sir Robbie Gibb. These are two people we're going to focus on a lot in this video. Robbie Gibb is a co-founder and early fundraiser of the pro-Trump TV news station GB News. So Sir Robbie Gibb, who is a board member at the BBC, co-founded GB News, who are going to town on the BBC at the moment and are gaining on the BBC. And you're wondering whether this is an inside job. It's absolutely staggering. Co-owned by hedge fund multimillionaire Paul Marshall. He's also important. Earlier this year, Marshall called for the BBC to be dismantled. The revelations raise questions about whether a network of Trump-aligned interests helped engineer the BBC's worst governance crisis in a decade. Under intensifying political pressure, the BBC chair, Samir Shah, another guy you're going to watch out for, apologized for what he called an error of judgment shortly after Director General Tim Davie and the BBC News chief Deborah Turness resigned in the ensuing crisis. I just want to show you something, a kind of flow chart, if you like, that's all the people that you're hearing about. And this is from 2024. This is an old flowchart, March 2024. But it shows you how everyone's connected. So you've got Robbie Gibb, this BBC director, right in the middle here. You've got Samir Shah, the chair of the BBC. You've got Andrew Neil, the former BBC really right-wing commentator. One of the many right-wing commentators on the BBC. Any left-wing ones like James O'Brien get kicked out for being too left-wing. And this is the appeasement of the right that people don't understand is going on. Boris Johnson up here, Nadine Dorries, now a Reform MP, Michael Prescott, friend of Robbie Gibb, and Stephen Giles. You got all shortlisted for the Ofcom role, which is a regulator of the press. So the regulators of the press are put in place. The people in Ofcom were put in place by the previous Conservative government. You got BBC board put in place by the Conservative government. And then you're wondering why all of this inside job when Michael Prescott is supposedly a third party impartiality advisor to the BBC, then has this leaked memo, and you're like, all of these people. I mean, you can go and look at the details of how all of these people are connected. And by the way, Robbie Gibb also bid together for the Jewish Chronicle with William Shawcross, 100% owner of the Jewish Chronicle. And then William Shawcross was the Commissioner for Public Appointments since 2021, deciding whether to investigate Robbie Gibb, blah, blah, blah. All of this is absolutely incestuous. So sorry, I wasn't even sharing that with you. So this is the flowchart. I do apologize that all of that meant very little to you because you didn't see this. So the flowchart here really gives you a sense of how all of these people are connected in terms of what's been going on at the heart of the BBC. And as I say, Robbie Gibb, this chap in the middle, is the glue that binds it all together. You have Samir Shah down here, who is the chairman, and as I say, Andrew Neil, all of these others, Boris Johnson, Nadine Dorries, recommended Michael Grade for Ofcom. So, the regulators that regulate are skewed to the right wing. The people on the board of the directors in the BBC, it's skewed to the right wing. The people that got Michael Prescott in, 3 out of the 4 of them that sat on the interview board were skewed to the right wing. They get him in. He then leaks a memo that's in line with Robbie Gibb, who's a BBC director, saying the BBC, essentially, it's like Robbie Gibb wants the downfall of the BBC to take place. Okay, so then we go back to the Byline Times article. But the man behind the memo is far from a neutral auditor. So this is Michael Prescott. He's a right-wing lobbyist working as a managing director for nearly a decade at Hanover Communications, a firm with long-standing Conservative Party ties. Byline Times can reveal that Hanover Communications has been paid at least $500,000 by 4 American media and technology corporations whose founders and executives are closely tied to Donald Trump. According to official EU and UK lobbying disclosures seen by the Byline Times, Prescott's firm represents Oracle, Apple, Meta, and Paramount, a roster that spans the core of big tech, US entertainment, and news media. The latest filings show payments in the 6-figure range for the last financial year, covering both regulatory lobbying in Brussels and political communications in Westminster. The new evidence suggests that Prescott's memo lends weight to the concerns of BBC insiders that its use was choreographed as part of a wider attack on the corporation by forces aligned with the US president. And then it goes on to talk particularly about Larry Ellison and Oracle, and Larry Ellison taking over. So his son is at Skydance, which merged with Paramount, and you had Trump suing Paramount, suing CBS, which is owned by Paramount, but they paid out because they wanted to get permission to merge with Skydance. And then Skydance, with Larry Ellison's son in, has now put Barry Weiss in charge of CBS News, who's a right wing, skews to the right wing, and they're now platforming her entity Free Press, which is skewed to the right wing, and is a way of Trump controlling the press. Well, actually, these are the people that are associated with Michael Prescott, who's the guy that came out with the leaked memo. And then it talks about how you got Tim Cook here as well from Apple. Anyway, we're going to join it later here. In Westminster, the UK Office for the Registrar of Consultant Lobbyists confirms Meta Platforms and Paramount Global as current Hanover clients. Both are engaged in broadcast and online safety legislation, including the Online Safety Act. That's the regulations just been passed by the Labour government, and its implications for content moderation and advertising markets. These companies operate within Trump's orbit. Meta donated to Trump's inaugural fund, while Paramount sits firmly inside Ellison's media constellation. And of course, they've just paid out $16 billion to Donald Trump. Earlier this year, Larry Ellison helped his son David, owner of Skydance Media, acquire Paramount Global, creating Paramount Skydance. The new conglomerate owns CBS News, where it's shaken things up in line with MAGA priorities, just purchased Barry Weiss's anti-woke Substack outlet, The Free Press, and is moving to buy Warner Bros. Discovery, the parent of CNN. Viacom, now Paramount, bought Channel 5, which is one of the UK's terrestrial TV channels, on the 1st of May 2014. And after the 7th of August 2025 merger with Skydance, the parent company's name became Paramount Skydance. In short, Ellison is moving rapidly to cement domination of the news, film, and television markets while gaining a foothold in the UK. Each of these pro-Trump corporations has a direct stake in how technology and media regulation are reported in Britain. Their revenues and reputations depend on public narratives about AI, online safety, platform liability, and media competition, debates led by the BBC and other agenda-setting outlets. While the Telegraph has presented Mike Prescott as an impartial advisor to the BBC, The role of his firm in lobbying on behalf of pro-Trump media and technology giants actively seeking to control the media landscape is a major conflict of interest. Right, so then it goes on, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but it goes on to say that Prescott was Robbie Gibb's boy, and Robbie Gibb was Boris Johnson's boy, and the Conservative-led UK government put all these people in place. Prescott is now a close associate of Sir Robbie Gibb, the former Downing Street communications chief, who helped launch GB News and now sits on the BBC board, a connection that raises questions about how Prescott came to be appointed as a supposedly independent advisor. We'll come to more of that a bit later. I'm just going to finish off this Byline Times article with the Robbie Gibb bit that I think gives you a sense of the connections here. After leaving Number 10 in 2019, Gibb became a de facto co-founder of GB News, helping to raise funds and recruit its launch team before returning to the BBC. That move placed him simultaneously inside the corporation's governance structure and at the heart of a rival network designed to challenge it, and arrangements that some insiders saw as a clear conflict. It should never have happened. As a result, Gibb's influence reaches far beyond Portland Place. His early GB News fundraising brought him close to hedge fund billionaire Paul Marshall, who in addition to the TV news channel owns The Spectator and Unheard. These are two really Spectator, particularly on the far right. Unheard claims it's a little bit kind of anti-woke libertarian, but it's clearly conservative right. This year, Marshall has fought to expand GB News into the American market, where the channel cultivated endorsements from Trump-aligned figures in Washington. Earlier this year, in March, Marshall described the BBC as a giant toad that should be broken up or sold, rhetoric that echoed Trump's attacks on the US public broadcaster NPR, describing it as the propaganda arm of the state who asked ultimately its paymasters. He added that, quote, the BBC should be broken up to separate its, quote, public service elements like news and documentaries from, quote, entertainment, drama, sport, adding, quote, the latter should be privatized and allowed to compete with other entertainment companies. So you've got all these people associated with the desire to disband the BBC and break it up, and one of these people is sitting on a board of freaking directors and is involved, it appears, in Michael Prescott releasing this memo. In August, GB News officially launched in the US via Truth Plus, the sister channel to Donald Trump's social media platform Truth Social. Its new channel features non-stop praise for Trump and attacks on the UK. 11 members of Trump's cabinet attended the launch party, which was headlined by Reform UK leader Nigel Farage, and that's why he went over to that committee hearing. The overwhelmingly pro-Tory makeup of the panel that appointed Michael Prescott, by the way, including Sir Robbie Gibb, raises further questions about allegations that BBC insiders that the memo and its weaponization against the BBC were part of a culture war coup. Okay, so Lionel Barber here, who was a former FT, wasn't he, editor of the Financial Times up to 2020, says a memo to the BBC board. Here it is. Do not fold like ABC and CBS and Wall Street law firms when faced with Trump bully boy shakedown tactics. He does not have a case, even in Florida. The panorama splicing was a dumb mistake, and the execs responsible should have long ago been fired. But there are serious issues. There are serious issues in the BBC newsroom for the next Director General to deal with. But Tim Davie and the BBC board could make standing up to Trump and his $1 billion lawsuit their finest hour. Completely agree. Dave Lawrence here says in the UK, he is timed out. In the US, he could file, but he was not broadcast. So he's talking about Trump's court case. So timed out in the UK. That year, statute of limitations has gone. In the US, he could file, but the program was not broadcast there. And he's also facing other lawsuits alleging his involvement. So reputational damage case fails. In other words, there is, I think, a very thin case for Donald Trump here. I think he's actually going to struggle to put a case together and be able to prosecute effectively. And I think BBC should be buoyed by that. John Simpson said Donald Trump's demand for $1 billion from the BBC comes from a local Florida law firm. It was sent to the wrong address, and the writer didn't know what salacious really means. Due to their salacious nature, the fabricated statements that were aired by the BBC, blah, blah, blah. And of course, they weren't salacious. It already got off to a pretty poor start. Right, now we're going to go kind of on to the next section here, which is just looking at Michael Prescott's claims in a little bit more detail. Reuters here, what are the key claims made in the leaked internal BBC memo, which I think was a 19-page document. So really, the Trump program is the headline, but actually is relatively minor. I know lots of people are saying how bad it is. I mean, it is bad to do what they did. I'm not denying that, but it's just the whole scheme of things. It's not. It doesn't warrant what is going on now. You got Israel Hamas coverage. That the claim is that BBC Arabic service was selectively covering stories critical of Israel. So there's a bias towards Hamas there. You have transgender coverage, which was treated with kind of kid gloves. People didn't want to get involved in very kind of messy arguments and programming on transgender. The memo said the BBC failed to cover a case in which a group of nurses sued their employer over a policy of allowing a transgender woman to use a women's changing room. So again, it's like meh. Immigration issues and historians. We're going to look at this in a little bit more detail later. Prescott noted that BBC sent few push notifications about illegal immigrants or asylum seekers in its 7 million news app users, even as less significant stories received extensive coverage. And the memo also said that the producers of 4 BBC programs with historical content favored non-expert academics who offered quotable sound bites on racism and prejudice, producing oversimplified and distorted narratives about British colonialism, slavery, and their legacy. There's way more in this that looks entirely like they've imported this from the US, where they're trying to rewrite history. I talked to you the other day about how they've got rid of these these commemorative commemorations, I should say, to black fighters in the Dutch American War Memorial. They've started, the Smithsonian Museum, and I think other museums have been under pressure to rewrite kind of history or make it look like slavery wasn't such a bad thing. And, there's taking out from the Department of Defense websites any, reference to minority groups doing well, awards and medals and whatnot, and Native Americans and black and so on and so forth, people who had fought. The idea is that they're trying to kind of whitewash history in a way that, hey, slavery is really uncomfortable. We need to make sure that we're not talking too accurately about slavery and putting it too much as an important thing. It needs to be kind of sidelined and we need to forget about it. Well, kind of this is what Michael Prescott was kind of asking for. And we'll get into the details of this in a bit. And he also said that the BBC failed too easily for putting out ill-researched material that suggested issues of racism when there were none. So essentially accusing the BBC of being too kind of liberal in a number of different ways, but these are problematic, as I hope you will see soon. So, okay, let's just look at the reaction to all of this from GB News, because these guys are accusing the BBC of being propaganda and biased, and you're like, are you serious?
Members of my own family and friends, they're perfectly sensible, sane, intelligent people, just now regard the BBC as, just not something that resonates with them, that it's just a bit too biased. They just can't get a straightforward view of the world.
BBC News in particular, deserves all the criticism it gets.
It's not because we all just want to have a bash on the BBC.
Yes,
it's
because
they're doing things that need scrutinising and they don't like it. The news coverage,
which is hilarious because these guys just can say what the hell they like.
Which by and large, the polling evidence does back up that the people have confidence in.
So that last guy is absolutely right. By and large, actually, what you guys are saying is not backed up by data in people's opinions. It's still regarded around the world as the most reliable news provider. Here is another guy sounding off. Actually, I think it's the same guy as you just heard.
I think it's hard for me to answer on behalf of the whole party, but I know personally from personal experience, I've been fascinated. Even if you just look at the local media, how something major happens, for example, at county level, and they're just not interested, they run on nonsense stories. So I think the BBC ultimately has lost the trust of the British people. It has for a very long time.
And again, here we have another Reform guy on GB News sounding off against the BBC. So the GB News is just Reform UK's political platform. I can't understand how it's not been regulated out of here. I can because Ofcom has been stacked with people from the Boris Johnson era. So the guy you can see there, Jamie McIver, has zero place commentating on accountability or trust. He was a Conservative councillor, but he was kicked out of the Conservative Party due to misconduct. And instead of calling for a by-election, he just defected to Reform UK, and he's not paid back his bounce back loan, and his business record shows huge mismanagement. So this guy is calling the BBC, or saying the BBC has lost the trust of the British people. And it's like, okay, pot calling the kettle black here. And then we have more GB News propaganda.
Talk to you about the BBC. Once a trusted institution, now little more than a propaganda channel. We're
like, it's sickening, this kind of stuff. Little more than a propaganda channel says the channel funded by Reform UK peeps, and where Nigel Farage has a program on that, but it can't be regulated because he's not producing a news program on GB News. All right, okay, that he's not reporting on news. Okay, so we can't regulate it because basically, essentially, you shouldn't allow, politicians are not allowed to present news programs because of obvious conflicts of interest and biases. But Nigel Farage is allowed to present a news program on GB News, but because they get away with saying, but it's not a news program, it's just an opinion program. Okay, sure thing.
quick to sneer at Russian state TV as a mouthpiece for Putin. But the BBC, what's the difference? It's just the British version, only slicker, smugger, and dressed up in self-righteous neutrality. Bit by bit, though, the mask is slipping. Whistleblower.
It just makes me feel a little bit sick listening to her. Like somebody speaking from GB News point of view, attacking another channel for issues over impartiality and calling them propagandistic. Just absolutely staggering. And then, do you know why? Why that's particularly galling? This is GB News when Donald Trump was leaving the I forget where it was, but this was in on the state visit to the UK, and the guy that you see saluting is the GB News journalist.
The most awesome vehicle, bulletproof glass, bomb-proof, and quite a sight to behold, especially against the backdrop of Windsor Castle.
Salute them as they go by. Sincerely am. What a magnificent moment, Rafe.
And this is
saluting the American president as he goes by. No saluting of the king or anything British, saluting Donald Trump. And that is how in bed GB News are with MAGA American politics. There is a much bigger project at play here. And remember, this is Peter Jukes in the Byline Times saying, if you have a doubt that MAGA attack on the BBC is not coordinated, read what GB News owner told the US, quote, we need, is this Paul Marshall? We need you to come and save us, to rescue us. You are making America great again. We need to make Britain great again. We are importing Trumpism into the United Kingdom, and GB News is at the forefront, and this attack on the BBC is all part of that. Alex Taylor here says, I spent 35 years covering media all over Europe. The UK has the best and the worst is gutter press. Even though it makes mistakes, like all broadcasters, the BBC is the best. It should fight, not cave in, because if populists get their way, the UK will end up with only the worst. That is what will happen. Right, The Observer has a fascinating piece on this Prescott memo and who Prescott is, and the Prescott memo flunks the impartiality test. Now, there's so much, this is a massively long article. There's so much I'd love to talk about in this. If we go to talk about Prescott here, but Prescott went way further than the edits. His letter states that the BBC's entire coverage of the 2024 election was biased against Trump, and his objections range from the debatable to the downright partisan. His scruple over the BBC's reporting of Trump's violent language about his Republican enemy, Liz Cheney, seems, in the light of the Charlie Kirk murder, highly dubious. Prescott argues the BBC News put too much emphasis on the passage in the single Trump-Harris debate where Trump repeated a racist urban myth propagated by his running mate J.D. Vance that pets were being eaten by Haitian migrants. I think reasonable people can be forgiven for agreeing with the BBC on that one. Or take this from Prescott, quote, in covering Trump's legal wrangles during the campaign, the BBC often failed to highlight that many US prosecutors are political appointees. This prevented viewers from having an understanding of the anti-Trump lawfare at play during the presidential race. Now, the use of the term lawfare, and this is a good point here, as a neutral term by Prescott, when it was in fact a partisan Republican charge, is indicative. Lawfare is like an American term, really. And this is the sort of thing you would say if you're in bed with like the American right. Especially when he then goes on to object to BBC reports framing the abortion and family planning debates as being about reproductive rights. This is one-way inconsistency. Now, I suggest you go and look at a recent really good interview on The Rest Is Politics UK, where they interview a British New York Times journalist who talks about how Reform UK are starting to get into bed with big lobbying groups in the United States who are pro-life lobbying groups, and there looks to be at least influence and possibly money coming from these groups into Reform UK, and the populist right in the UK is starting to get Christianized. You're starting to hear about Christian nationalism from the people on the Unite the Kingdom rally. And Nigel Farage brought up abortion, which is not on our agenda. We don't. It's not a thing in the UK as far as being a political hot potato here. And yet Reform then picked it up. Or Nigel Farage talked about it in a presser the other day. Why is that suddenly on the agenda? So money. This is what is happening with the BBC is indicative of a much larger issue, and I really do think that's a problem. I'm going to find that for you. Apologies if I said The Rest Is Politics UK. I should have said Pod Saves the UK. Here is part of a fascinating interview. I'd love to show you like a good 25 minutes of interview here, but we'll just get into the beginning of it.
So you might have noticed that Nigel Farage has taken a much harder line on abortion recently. Back when he was the head of the Brexit Party, he had no stance on the topic. Yet out of the blue, last November, Farage began calling for the abortion time limit to be reduced from 24 weeks to 22. And here he is again talking about the subject in May of this year.
I am pro-choice, but I think it's ludicrous. Utterly ludicrous that we can allow abortion up to 24 weeks.
Thanks to a recent New York Times investigation, which claims growing links between anti-abortion activists in the US and Reform, we know a lot more about what's behind Farage's keen interest in our wombs. A key force behind the Supreme Court's controversial decision to overturn Roe versus Wade and end the constitutional right to abortion was the Christian conservative group, the Alliance Defending Freedom, or the ADF. And now they've set their sights on Britain.
Joining us in the studio is one of the reporters behind that investigation, Jane Bradley, and Lisa Hall-Garton, who's an advocate, educator and campaigner for sexual and reproductive rights and health, with a recent focus on young people's right to a better sex education. Welcome to Pod Save the UK, Jane and Lisa.
Thanks for having us.
I don't have a huge amount of background for Farage's interest in abortion until he starts sort of banging on about it. How sort of surprised were either of you to hear him talk about it? I mean, Jane, were you aware? Had you been looking into this for a while? I presume that story was quite a long time in the making.
No, I was surprised as you were when he started talking about this. And that is kind of what started me off investigating this. I've covered British politics for about 18 years, and I can't remember a time Farage has ever made abortion a campaign issue. So I was like, that's weird. Why is he suddenly talking about abortion? What's the immigration link here? Yeah. And at the same time, I'd noticed that this American Christian anti-abortion group called Alliance Defending Freedom had started funneling more money into its UK operation, basically expanding in the UK. So I had these two questions, which was, what is this anti-abortion group, which is one of the most influential in the US? You know, they helped overturn Roe v. Wade and end the constitutional right for abortion. Very high up allies in the White House. I was like, what's their interest in the UK? What are they up to here? And why on earth is Farage kind of speaking about abortion? And that's when I got a tip off from a Reform source who basically said that oh, if you're interested in influence and money, you should look at the ADF. They're basically positioning themselves as a power broker between the Trump administration and the UK right, and specifically, I found out, Reform and Farage.
Lisa, I guess like I've always taken the right for abortion as something that's not going to be contested in my lifetime. In the United Kingdom, frequently polling has just suggested the overwhelming majority of this country is in favour of preserving a woman's right to choose, and that it's a sort of non-issue. But given the kind of rollback on reproductive rights, and given the fact that a lot of the conversation in America was no one is talking about ending Roe v. Wade, nobody is talking about this, blah, blah, blah. Have you been more cautious about this the entire time, given your work?
I mean, we've seen the influence of anti-abortion campaign and anti-abortion funding in the UK forever. This feels like a real ramping up.
Right.
What was interesting for me with the overturning of Roe v. Wade was people in the UK went, this is terrible, this is such a shock. But anyone watching and paying attention would have seen that the campaign against Roe v. Wade started in 1973, the minute the ruling was handed down. And the moment Trump tipped the Supreme Court in favour of anti-abortion judges.
So I'm going to leave it there. But what they do is they detail the influence of these organisations into UK politics, and you're starting to see Nigel Farage talk about things that he never would have talked about previously. He's not on the UK political agenda. Well, again, it's this Americanization of UK politics, where there's money and influence coming from people associated with the Heritage Foundation, with the Trump administration, with all the classic kind of like movements like ADF, and you are just seeing like the BBC being attacked. You're seeing the growth of the populist right. It's all part of the same thing here. So this BBC scandal is far more indicative of some really big things going on than you might realize. As a quote from the Observer article saying, there's not a single word in, going back to Michael Prescott's memo, a word here about the BBC's political, business, education, health, royalty, home affairs, climate change, or crime coverage, or even Ukraine. Like the whole thing is very much selected on some real some cherry-picked issues, and fascinating. Now, we're actually going to come down to this thing about historians, because I think, again, this is just a fascinating little soupçon of what was going on with Prescott's memo. In the middle of the letter, Prescott suddenly includes an item that acts, if nothing else, as a tell. The section is headed History Reclaimed, so that's a group, History Reclaimed, asks BBC to use expert historians and is ignored. So History Reclaimed. Think about who we're reclaiming our own history. Think about who they might be, right? This item was not the result of work done by David Grossman, but of Prescott himself noticing an article in the Daily Telegraph. A group of historians called History Reclaimed had reviewed 4 BBC programmes and concluded, in Prescott's words, that the corporation had produced, quote, an overly simplistic and distorted narrative about British colonial racism, slave trading and its legacy. Following the Telegraph story, he writes, I suggested a meeting of relevant BBC commissioners, producers and editors to review what History Reclaimed was claiming and assess whether any of its recommendations might help improve future programmes. But no one took him up on his suggestion, providing yet more evidence of the BBC's culture of bias. So, who are History Reclaimed? According to Prescott, they are, quote, a group of renowned historians, mainly senior post holders at Oxford and Cambridge. And that's it. But the most cursory research tells you that it is a group of historians who, however renowned, have a very particular outlook and agenda. The founder of History Reclaimed, Robert Toombs, is a leading pro-Brexit scholar, and the group has the proclaimed mission of rescuing the reputation of empire and colonialism from the obloquy to which they feel they have been condemned. On its website, we can read a review of Nigel Biggar's Slavery and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt, enjoy work of Professor Bruce Gilley of Portland State University, who is also the author of The Case for Colonialism, and, quote, and another book, The German Colonial Achievement and Its Aftermath. Its adherents include several fellows of the New Right Legatum Institute, now the Prosperity Institute of New Right relics of the old Revolutionary Communist Party and the Brexit Party, now Reform UK. Why did Prescott not acknowledge any of this? Good journalists at the BBC will find it hard to accept castigation from someone who either leaves out vital information or who hasn't done the most basic research. Ironically, Prescott's letter had me worrying not about the BBC's journalism, but about how the preoccupations and prejudice of independent advisors had come to play such a major role in guiding editorial discussion. So it's a big old piece in this Observer that I think is well worth a careful read. But I think there are some real tells, as they say in this Observer piece, tells about who Michael Prescott is and what his letter really was doing here, which is, this is essentially kind of historical revisionism, the sort of which you're seeing with MAGA republicanism right now, but in the UK context here. And this is what Michael Prescott is trying to lobby for. So then there's another Byline Times article, the pro-Trump bias of the neutral sources in the leaked BBC Prescott dossier. And this is a big look at, again, it looks at History Reclaimed and Lawyers for Israel, the connections of Michael Prescott and Robbie Gibb, and how they are connected to these movements that really are very aligned to Trump, essentially. That constellation places History Reclaimed, we just heard about, within the same ideological universe as GB News and its counterparts, a populist movement that recasts culture and scholarship as political battlegrounds. Prescott's decision to treat its work as objective evidence of BBC bias reveals more about his sympathies than about the broadcaster's journalism. Another contributor is James Orr, who's just, by the way, signed up for Reform UK as their advisor. He is a Christian nationalist anti-abortion guy, senior advisor to Nigel Farage and the British Sherpa of Trump's Vice President, J.D. Vance. If History Reclaimed embodies the culture war flank of the campaign against the BBC, UK Lawyers for Israel, so it's another associated organisation, provides its legal one. The group makes no pretense of neutrality, describing itself as, quote, an association of lawyers who support Israel using their legal skills, and vehemently criticising the International Criminal Court's investigations of alleged war crimes in Gaza, and fundamentally opposing the International Court of Justice genocide case brought by South Africa against Israel. Its directors include Jonathan D.C. Turner and Caroline Turner, who have threatened hospitals and arts venues with legal action over displays deemed sympathetic to Palestinians, and so on and so forth. So it looks at the connections between these people and History Reclaimed and Michael Prescott, and then you start understanding why this leaked memo came out, right? We're going to move on from that piece, though. And just, I want to remind you something I said the other day. Someone else saying that in the memo, the claim was the BBC focused too heavily on campaign issues promoted by the Harris campaign, such as abortion and women's rights, at the expense of giving greater weight to jobs, the economy, and immigration, which proved to be a significant driver of how people voted, said Prescott. And someone points out this is talking too much about abortion and women's rights. That's an anti-Trump bias, apparently. And of course, this then harkens back to what we just heard in the Pod Save the UK interview there, and what actually I haven't gone through just for reasons of time, but you're starting to see all these connections between the kind of pro-life Christian nationalism in the United States, pro-Israel agenda, and so on and so forth. And Michael Prescott clearly was not an impartial advisor, an advisor on impartiality, an impartial advisor on impartiality. There's absolutely no way he was. So we're just going to go to town on that a little bit more. So Byline Times can confirm that the 4-person BBC panel that interviewed Michael Prescott and made the decision to appoint him as an advisor, 3 of them had long-standing party links to the Conservative Party. Okay, now you're starting to understand what's going on. Staff watching. So then you had insiders in the BBC just recently. There were questions to, I think, Samir Shah, the chair of the BBC, about Davey. And then you had these anonymous questions that were put from BBC insiders watching there was a internal kind of video conference, and people were absolutely horrified about what's going on from inside the BBC. Staff watching Tim Davey, who's a director general, then stepped down. Staff watching Davey's address tried to raise the issue of Gibbs' place on the board. Why is Robbie Gibbs still on the board? Asked one. The board needs independent oversight free from political interference, said another. Until Robbie Gibb and any other political appointee are removed, we cannot possibly be truly trusted. trusted to be an unbiased organization. So rather than this organization being a left-wing biased organization, the people inside the BBC are saying we are like being attacked from the right inside our organization, and we are biased from the top down to the right. Another said, I find Robbie Gibbs' continued presence at the BBC to be incredibly demoralizing. It feels as if we're fighting against, he is fighting against and undermining the work we are trying to do. So this is a Guardian article. MPs and BBC staff call for Robbie Gibbs to leave Broadcasters Board. Boris Johnson's appointee is accused of pushing claims of institutional bias at the corporation after shock resignations. So remember, going back to that flowchart, here, Robbie Gibb is firmly at the centre, and he's the guy that people are saying he needs to go. Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, said Robbie Gibb was appointed to the BBC board by Boris Johnson, was an editorial advisor to GB News, worked as Theresa May, the Conservative Prime Minister's Director of Communications. He's not impartial or neutral. The government should remove him from the board immediately to protect the BBC's independence. And Ed Davey then wrote a piece as leader of the Lib Dems in The Guardian saying the first steps towards saving our precious BBC remove Robbie Gibb from the board, and goes to town on, who Robbie Gibb is and, what his connections are. Interesting piece there. And then you have another Guardian article saying the BBC board member with Tory links led the charge in systemic bias claims, say insiders. Sources say Robbie Gibb amplified criticisms of Trump, Gaza, and trans rights coverage, and had a lot of oxygen in the room. Concerns sent on the relationship between Prescott and Gibb. Sources said Gibb, who had previously been accused of interfering in editorial matters, had led the charge at 2 BBC board meetings that discussed Prescott's memo. The most recent was last Thursday. Gibb is one of 13 board members. However, sources raised concerns about the editorial presence of many of the other members. Some newer board members were said to have agreed with Gibb, who has held the post for 4 years. It is understood that one board member who was supportive of the BBC's editorial efforts was away for the last week's meeting in which more pressure was placed on Turner over Prescott's memo. Insiders said the board's lack of editorial expertise meant Gibb had a lot of oxygen in the room. Suggestions of a political effort to pressure the BBC from the right have been denied. Boris Johnson has rejected any such suggestion as complete and utter bollocks. The BBC has said Gibb was only one of a four-person panel that appointed Prescott, and only one of 13 board members. In his letter, Prescott said his criticisms do not come with any political agenda. But many people are saying, well, that itself is bollocks, because there are 3 people on the board, on the panel that employed Prescott, who released this memo, and 3 out of the 4 of them had links to the Conservative Party, and Robbie Gibb is fully biased. David Oliver saying, I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories, but putting Robbie Gibb on a BBC board, him then lobbying hard for his right-wing corporate comms mate to review editorial policy, then someone leaking the internal report to the Tory graph, to the Telegraph, so they could weaponize it to force senior figures out. That's what's going on. Judy Street says these 2 resignations are merely symptoms of the disease. The cancer at the heart of the BBC is Robbie Gibb and Samir Shah. You've got then Nick Robinson, the former political editor, who himself is a Tory, right? He was in charge of the Student Conservative Party at the University of Oxford. He is being critical of this attack from the right here. The majority of the BBC board appear to agree with their editorial advisor that there is a problem of institutional bias reflected in the coverage of Donald Trump, Gaza, Israel, and trans rights. That argument is being led by one board member, Sir Robbie Gibb, a former BBC executive in charge of political programmes who became Prime Minister Theresa May's Downing Street Director of Communications, and one of those involved in the founding of GB News. Friends of Sir Robbie insist he has repeatedly and constantly supported Tim Davie and wanted him to stay, and has written articles supporting the BBC and the licence fee. As of last night, the BBC board's 15 members had still not agreed the wording of a statement that's due to be made. That's now been made by the BBC Samir Shah, I do believe. A final thought, I understand that at the time of transmission on the Panorama film in October 2024, there were no complaints received about the editing of Donald Trump's speech. It's just absolutely come out the blue. Now, Novara Media interpret Robbie Gibb and his presence as follows. BBC, and this is a left-wing media organisation, they say BBC advisor Michael Prescott, whose bias complaints helped topple 2 of the broadcaster's senior leaders, works for a PR firm with deep ties to the Conservative Party. Prescott was backed by BBC board member Robbie Gibb, a former owner of the pro-Israel newspaper, who advised on the founding of GB News. The resignations of Director General Tim Davie and Head of News Deborah Turness on Sunday, the 9th of November, which followed a week of damaging allegations against the corporation published in the Telegraph, have been described as a coup overseen by Tory figures who want to reshape the BBC. The Telegraph stories were based on a leaked memo submitted to the BBC's board by then advisor Prescott, who lambasted the organisation for its supposed anti-Israel bias, coverage of trans rights, and misleadingly edited video of Donald Trump. Prescott is a managing director of PE agency Hanover Communications, whose staff have gone on to work for the Conservative Party. Gibb, a BBC board member appointed in 2021 by Boris Johnson's government, reportedly submitted his own critical memo about the BBC coverage to the board in September. Gibb is said to be a friend of Prescott's and served as a Tory spin doctor under Theresa May. He helped to launch right-wing channel GB News and also a consortium in 2021 to buy the Jewish Chronicle, a staunchly pro-Israel newspaper. More than 400 media figures and celebrities, including Alexei Sayle and Mike Lee, signed a letter earlier this year to the BBC calling for Gibb to be sacked from the board. Quote, "We are concerned that an individual with close ties to the Jewish Chronicle has a say in the BBC's editorial decisions in any capacity," the letter said. In an analysis in June by the Centre for Media Monitoring found that the BBC had given Israeli deaths 33 times more coverage per fatality than Palestinian deaths. Last year, 25 BBC journalists wrote to managers with concerns that the corporation had suppressed coverage of an International Court of Justice ruling of a plausible genocide in Gaza. So they are at Novara Media claiming that actually there's actual evidential basis to the claim that the BBC is biased towards Israel and not towards Hamas. So yeah, or join these dots up. That's what I'm seeking to do here. Oh dear. And to continue to get a sense of who Robbie Gibb is and was, this is Robbie Gibb in 2018, before he was in the position he's in. Robbie Gibb: "After Brexit, we will stop paying large sums to the EU every year. This money, the Brexit dividend, can be spent on priorities like the NHS, as announced by the PM today." The idea here is that he is a massive Brexiteer regurgitating the now known to be lies about reusing the money that we save from coming out of Brexit to pile into the NHS. So for those in the UK, we'd know it's a famous kind of lie that was put on the side of the big red buses that were driving around saying we can spend £350 million pounds a week on the NHS, and it never happened. Anyway, this is kind of who Robbie Gibb is. Given Robbie Gibb is in the news, does someone want to ask him how this is going? Says Carol Cadwallader. Yeah. And then Peter Duke says, "Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Robbie Gibb, the BBC board member with the impartiality remit." This is Robbie Gibb, previously trapped by its own woke groupthink, the Today programme, which is a flagship Radio 4 BBC programme. So this is now the BBC director on the board of directors. trapped by its own woke groupthink, the Today programme, or Radio Misery, as my friends call it, bombards its listeners with a relentlessly negative and sneering tone and paints a picture of Britain that is monstrously out of touch. Interestingly, that's John Humphreys there, who's actually quite a right-wing guy. But there you go, and Nick Robertson as well. So, you know, oh well. That's who Robbie Gibb is, the kind of anti-woke guy at the centre of the BBC. And you're wondering, you know, why Michael Prescott came out and said what he said. So this is again going back to John Sopel here, talking about the situation.
Look, I am getting, as we speak, a kind of readout from various BBC staff members about a call that has just taken place between members of staff and the chairman of the BBC and the Director General, which there were apparently considerable expletives aimed at the chairman, Samir Shah. The call went down like a sack of proverbial sick, according to another one. And apparently Samir Shah's comment about it being disrespectful to the board to question whether they uphold BBC values kind of infuriated people. You know, it's particularly naff. Someone says Shah just totally and utterly underwhelming. You know, in 5 years from now, new broadcasting house will be a building for hire. So you can see that what damage this has done within the BBC itself, where, you know, people who are journalists who want to uphold the values of impartiality feel they've been betrayed by the board of the BBC. And this is a mutinous atmosphere by the sound of it.
If the BBC decides to back down in its entirety about this, in the face of pressure from the Trump administration.
And by the way, this is Lewis Goodall, who now is with the newsagents, but he was at the BBC and felt he was forced out actually by people that are mentioned.
It will have, ironically enough, acted deeply, deeply partially.
Yeah.
And it will have done so in this way. The Trump administration and the MAGA movement have been desperate since the election and the run-up to the election of 2024 to erase and reinvent history.
There you go.
They have been desperate to portray what happened on January 6th as something other than it was.
And this is all part of it, you can argue. Now, Alistair Campbell, former Labour spin doctor, said he should never have been there in the first place, Robbie Gibb. Boris Johnson damaged public life in so many ways, and this was one of them. We are now reaping what they have sowed. Labour government should back the BBC, support it against Trump, and fight back harder against the right-wing forces deliberately damaging Britain with a view to ejecting Labour from power. That is what's going on. This is a major assault on a centre-left government by the forces of the right, and they're using the BBC, and there's money coming in from the United States. There's support from Trump, there's support from MAGA, and you've got a MAGAnization of the UK political landscape. Alan Lester here says, well, who'd have guessed it? The main BBC board member resisting a simple apology and reinforcing the right-wing lobby's attempt to discredit the BBC from within was a Tory government appointee and a founder of GB News. If you want impartiality, Gibb has to go. And we have Implausible Blog here saying the BBC has been under attack long before President Trump. So Lewis Goodall here on the left, and then we have he explains how Robbie Gibb pretty much went after him. And on the right, you've got Carol Vorderman, who very famously used to be on the Channel 4 show Countdown. She's now become a bit of a political commentator. And I think she's got a show on LBC. Explains how Robbie Gibb pretty much went after her. So I'm not going to play you all of this. It's like 6 minutes of these guys discussing how actually Robbie Gibb went after these people and forced them away from the BBC when they had shows associated with the BBC. Robbie Gibb was appointed under the Johnson government, and all the rest we already know. The problem the BBC has is not a left-wing takeover, it's a right-wing takeover, trying to both sides everything instead of speaking facts and calling out fiction. The BBC may not be appreciated by all Brits, but it is a global institution respected in many parts of the world for accuracy and integrity in reporting. And if we want to protect the BBC, then it's not just rebuffing Trump, but also clearing out the political appointees, allowing the BBC to continue to focus on facts and not both sides in populist drivel. And Lewis Goodall, who you just saw there, said, working at the BBC, I felt that there was a strong awareness to be checking potential liberal left biases and very few from the other direction. In other words, we always had to think about not being too biased to the left, whilst ignoring whether we were going to be too biased to the right. And it's really interesting. Loads of stuff that we're now hearing about. So they weren't allowed to report on Brexit critically in the 2 years after Brexit, sort of 2016 to 2019. Coming from the top of the BBC, that, you know, that's done and dusted. You can't talk about it anymore. And there was loads of pressure not to be at all critical about Brexit. Fascinating. So this stuff is now coming out about that, and everyone's accusing the BBC of having left-wing bias, and of course you could accuse it of having the opposite. Nick Reeves here says Starmer is making the same catastrophic mistake as Biden. He is carrying on as if politics as usual still exists. So I'm just going to finish a video kind of broadly here, which is, this is not politics as usual. We are in this new era of politics, and particularly in Britain, that is a politics of right-wing populism rising. Now the Greens and Zach Polanski are trying to do something about that from a left-wing populist point of view, but kind of centrist politics is now under attack. And I would say Labour is pretty broadly centrist these days, is under attack from the right, but it has a real helping hand, the populist right, from the United States in terms of lobbying, in terms of money, in terms of influence from Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is now helping by trying to sue one of the bastions of British culture. So Nick Reeves, Starmer is trying to make the same catastrophic mistake as Biden. He is carrying on as if politics as usual still exists. This is deluded. Politics as usual is, for the time being, dead. Democracy is under attack by an immensely powerful and wealthy international klepto-fascist axis. It is not peacetime politics, it's a hybrid war. And I would bring in, by the way, here to add to that, what Russia is doing. It is a hybrid war, and we are being attacked from abroad. And you can argue we're being attacked from Russia as much as we're being attacked from America in terms of Twitter and the algorithms that are produced by Elon Musk, and the culture wars attacks from the populist right in America as much as from the Kremlin. Starmer must act urgently to strengthen our democracy, or we may well end up being in the hands of a pro-Russian fascist. We must not be complacent. The hard and far right dominate the traditional and online media spaces. We're going to have to fight a long and exhausting uphill battle. We need the government, our government, to help us, not to bury its head in the sand. Really well said. And Don McGowan here says, look, I'm writing a long two-parter for my Substack about Turning Point UK. So Turning Point UK, the US version, originally was a UK movement that was exported to the US weirdly, and it's kind of being re-exported back from the US, Charlie Kirk being Turning Point US guy. Don McGowan says, what occurs to me as a result of the BBC farrago is that we are entering a phase of political danger where the Trump MAGA movement is readying to pounce on the UK. Turning Point UK is the arm of MAGA. Farage is an asset of MAGA. GB News is an asset of MAGA. We have been set up by Steve Bannon, dark money from across the pond. So after Steve Bannon was kicked out of Trump 1.0, he came to Europe and started putting these things in place for a populist right-wing movement right across Europe and joining the dots for the populist right in Europe. Trump is now threatening the BBC with a $1 billion lawsuit over a piece of video that was edited badly and telling people to watch GB News instead. This is a coordinated, well thought out attack on a British institution designed to destabilize the country as a whole. The Labour government has been hugely undermined since it started by the right-wing media, allowing Farage and Reform to act as the official opposition. Again, not a coincidence. If Trump follows through with his threats, which have now been joined by Russia, what a surprise, then the BBC may teeter. Love them or hate them, the BBC is a cornerstone of the British community. If it falls, we are in serious danger. This may seem like conspiracy theory stuff, but it isn't. When you take a serious look at all the people in the background, as I have, the data is there. And I kind of rest my case. This is a much bigger thing than the BBC badly editing a Trump panorama piece. This is an attack on the norms and the mores and the traditions and the mechanisms and the institutions of establishment politics in the UK. And this is tearing down right-wing populism in the form of Reform UK, but actually in a form of MAGA and Kremlin, I'd say nationalism, almost ethno-nationalism. We're seeing that in the UK. The Unite the Kingdom marches, the rise of the far right in the UK, and the cheerleaders of Elon Musk and the mechanisms of Twitter, the mechanics of Twitter, and the right-wing biased, I think, information spaces and platforms. And then you've got Trump coming along as well. And the Kremlin, we are just under attack. This is war. This is information war. This is political war. And I've been ground down the last few days. I've been at my kind of lowest point. I don't get low and stuff like that, but I go and look at Twitter and I get demoralized at the sheer scope of the job that I feel I've got, people like me have got, to try and fight for sensible politics. And at the moment, we are teetering on the edge of welcoming in a burn it down right-wing populism that will damage us in a way that you just can't get it back. You lose a BBC, you lose it. It's gone. That's gone. Do we let the people like the Farages and the Trumps and the Putins of the world dictate to us our future? I would hope not. I am really worried at the moment. And do you just get ground down, or do you stand up and make your voice heard? And I'm afraid sometimes I feel like I get ground down, but damn it, I'm going to stand up and make my voice heard. And maybe many of you will disagree with me. You think I'm being some kind of liberal lefty? Well, so be it. But I think, it's time to dust off the old political armor. We need to be awake to what's happening under the bonnet. We need to join the dots, and there are many, many dots to join. Thank you for listening, for sticking out for so long. I really do appreciate it. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. Like, subscribe, and share, and do all that stuff. But in the meantime, take care, and I'll speak to you soon.